There's something you've been doing that feels right in the moment, but silently ruins your progress every single time. You talk about your plans. You share what you're about to do, the change you're going to make, the version of yourself you're becoming. And for a second, it feels good, like you've already moved forward, like you're already closer. But then something strange happens. You lose the urgency. You slow down. You don't follow through the way you thought you would. And you don't even realize why. Because no one told you this, every time you speak your plans out loud, you give your brain a false sense of completion. It's subtle, invisible, but it changes how you act. So let me ask you something, and be honest. What is one thing you've been talking about but still haven't done? Drop it in the comments. No filters, no pretending, because the moment you see it clearly, you stop lying to yourself. And that's where everything starts to change. Most people don't fail because they lack discipline. They fail because they misunderstand how motivation actually works. When you talk about your plans, your brain doesn't treat it as just words. It interprets it as progress. The moment you explain your goals to someone, describe the change you're about to make, or hear yourself saying, "This time will be different," your brain releases a small sense of reward. Not because you did the work, but because you signaled the identity. And that's where the problem begins, because your mind doesn't clearly separate real action from social acknowledgement. If other people react, if they nod, support you, or even just listen, your brain registers that as movement, as if something already started. But nothing actually did, so instead of building pressure to act, you accidentally release it. You trade execution for expression. And the more you do this, the more dangerous it becomes. Because now, without realizing it, you're conditioning yourself to feel progress without ever moving forward. The dangerous part is not that you talk about your plans, it's what happens next, silently. After you say it out loud, something inside you relaxes. The tension that was pushing you to act, it weakens. That internal pressure, the one that usually forces movement, gets replaced by a subtle sense of, "I'm already on my way." But you're not. You just created the illusion of momentum. And your brain loves that, because real action is uncomfortable. It requires effort, uncertainty, friction. But talking is easy. Talking gives you validation without resistance, so your mind starts preferring it. You begin to unconsciously replace execution with expression, work with words, progress with intention, and over time this becomes a pattern. You get used to announcing things, feeling good about it, and then slowly disconnecting from the action itself. Not because you're lazy, but because you trained your brain to associate speaking with achieving. And once that association is created, discipline alone won't fix it. At some point, this stops being about habits and becomes about identity. Because every time you speak about what you're going to do, you start seeing yourself as the kind of person who is already changing. Not because you proved it, but because you described it. And the mind is highly suggestible. It builds your self-image based on repetition, not accuracy. So if you keep talking about discipline, growth, focus, you begin to feel aligned with those traits. But feeling aligned is not the same as being aligned. This is where people get stuck for years. They genuinely believe they're improving, because internally their identity already shifted. They think, "I'm working on it. I'm becoming better. I'm different now." But when you look at their actions, nothing actually changed. Because the identity was built through words, not behavior. And identity built without evidence is fragile. It doesn't hold under pressure, it doesn't translate into consistency, and it collapses the moment real effort is required. That's why some people keep restarting their lives over and over again. Not because they don't want to change, but because they already feel like they did. It gets even more dangerous when other people are involved. Because the moment you share your plans, you don't just affect yourself, you activate a response from the outside world. People react, they support you, they encourage you. Sometimes they even admire you for what you intend to do. And that reaction feels real. It gives you recognition before you've done anything to earn it, and your brain absorbs that instantly. Validation, even when it's premature, still feels like progress. So now it's not just your internal system being affected. Your environment starts reinforcing the illusion. You say you're going to change, and people start seeing you as someone who is changing. You talk about your goals, and others respond as if you're already on that path. And slowly, without noticing, you begin to live off that perception, not the work itself. This is why some people talk a lot about what they're building, but never actually build it. Because the social reward replaces the real reward, and once that happens, your motivation is no longer tied to execution. It's tied to being seen as someone who executes. If you pay close attention, the people who actually move forward rarely talk about what they're about to do, not because they're hiding, but because they understand something most people don't. Energy is limited. And every time you explain your plans, justify your intentions, or describe your next move, you're spending part of that energy. Before the work even begins, highly focused people protect that. They don't waste clarity trying to be understood. They don't dilute intention through conversation. They keep it contained because they know that the moment you expose a goal too early, you weaken its force. It stops being something internal, something that drives you, and becomes something external. Something to talk about, something to explain, something to maintain in front of others. And that changes everything, because now, instead of acting from necessity, you start acting from expectation. And expectation is fragile. It depends on mood, on feedback, on how you feel that day. But internal commitment? That doesn't negotiate. That doesn't need to be seen. That doesn't need to be validated. It just moves. Quietly, consistently, relentlessly. At some point, talking about your plan stops being a mistake and becomes an escape. A very convincing one, because it looks productive. It sounds intentional. It gives the impression that you're doing something with your life. But in reality, it's a way to avoid the only thing that actually matters: execution. Instead of facing the discomfort of starting, you describe what you're going to do. Instead of dealing with uncertainty, you explain your strategy. Instead of risking failure, you talk about potential, and your mind accepts it. Because it's easier, there's no resistance in talking, no friction, no chance of immediate failure. So, without realizing it, you build a pattern. Whenever things get real, you shift back into words. You plan more, you explain more, you share more, and you delay action, not consciously, but consistently. This is why some people stay in the same place for years, even though they're always thinking, always planning, always about to start, because they trained themselves to replace movement with narrative. And the longer this goes on, the harder it becomes to break. The real damage isn't immediate. That's why most people don't notice it. It doesn't destroy your progress in one moment. It erodes it over time, quietly. Every time you talk instead of act, you weaken the connection between intention and execution. You tell yourself you're going to do something, and then you don't. Not fully, not consistently. And your brain registers that, not as failure, but as a pattern. A pattern where your words don't lead to action. And once that pattern repeats enough times, something shifts internally. You stop trusting yourself, not consciously, but in subtle ways. You hesitate more. You delay more. You start questioning your own decisions, because deep down your mind has learned something dangerous. What you say doesn't mean you'll follow through, and that breaks something essential. Because discipline isn't just about doing things, it's about believing that when you decide something, you will actually do it. Without that internal trust, everything becomes harder. Consistency feels forced, motivation feels unstable, and progress becomes unpredictable. Not because you're incapable, but because you disconnected your words from your actions. If you want to fix this, you don't start by doing more. You start by saying less. Not as a rule, but as a shift in how you handle your own intentions. From now on, every time you feel the urge to talk about a plan, pause and ask yourself something simple. Why do I feel the need to say this right now? Is it clarity or is it validation? Because most of the time, it's not about organizing your thoughts. It's about releasing tension. You want to feel like you've started without actually starting. And once you see that clearly, you can interrupt it. You stop using words as a substitute for action. Instead, you contain the intention. You keep it internal, unresolved, active. Because that tension, the one you used to release by talking, is exactly what fuels execution. It's what pushes you to move, to act, to close the gap. So instead of dissipating it, you hold it. And that changes everything. Because now your energy is no longer spread across explanations. It's directed into action. Acting in silence is not about being secretive. It's about being precise. When you stop announcing your plans, you remove an entire layer of distraction. There's nothing to maintain, no image to protect, no expectations to meet. It's just you and the work. And that creates a different kind of focus. You're no longer performing progress. You're building it. Quiet execution forces honesty. Because there's no audience to impress, you can't fake consistency. Either you do the work or you don't. And that clarity is powerful. It simplifies everything. You stop negotiating with yourself. You stop explaining delays. You stop creating stories around what you intend to do. You just act. Small steps, repeated, without noise. And over time, something shifts again. But this time, it's real. Your identity starts to rebuild based on evidence, not words. You begin to trust your own decisions again, because now when you think something, you follow through. And that's where discipline stops feeling forced. It becomes natural. At the end of the day, this isn't about staying silent for the sake of it. It's about protecting something most people lose without even noticing: the connection between who you say you are and what you actually do. Because every time you speak without acting, that connection weakens. And every time you act without speaking, it strengthens quietly. No one sees it at first. There's no recognition, no immediate validation, just effort, just repetition, just you, proving something to yourself. And that's exactly why it works. Because real change doesn't need an audience. It doesn't need approval. It doesn't need to be understood. It only needs consistency. So maybe the next step isn't announcing what you're about to do. Maybe it's the opposite. Maybe it's choosing one thing and saying nothing about it. No explanation, no build-up, no external pressure, just action. And this time, actually following through. So think about it. What is something you're going to do without telling anyone this time?